Let's talk about sensory loss and future risk of dementia. It's a pretty well-known and established concept that a loss of a major sense is associated with future risk of dementia. This includes specifically olfactory sense, which is your sense of smell, hearing loss, visual loss, and even loss that includes vestibular dysfunction. Why this happens is a little bit unclear. They don't know if it's because of environmental factors, like people with hearing loss become more socially isolated, and because they're socially isolated, they become more depressed and anxious, or is it because of a specific biological factor that has something to do with the loss of those senses that leads to dementia? But what I want to do today is cover some basic neuron science and talk about how this might be related to future dementia. At a fundamental level, all a neuron needs is fuel and it needs activation. So that means oxygen and glucose is part of the picture, but it also means that it has to be used and has to be stimulated on a regular basis in order for that neuron to be healthy. Whenever you go through a sensory loss, like hearing loss or visual loss or olfactory loss, that means some of the neurons that are firing into your brain are no longer stimulating those portions of the brain anymore. And when you don't get stimulation for those periods of the brain, the principle of if you don't use it, then you lose it starts to apply. Some of those neurons will start to degrade. Some of them will go through something called transneural degeneration. And then you start to lose chunks of that brain matter that were once dedicated to the experience of our senses, specifically for smelling, for hearing, for vision, and for vestibular sense. So all of your senses are super important, right? So whether it's hearing or smell or vision, your brain really wants access to all of your senses all the time. But especially when it comes to vision and hearing loss, when you lose those senses, you lose access to large swaths of your brain that are actually dedicated towards those specific functions. But you also lose the association areas because it's not just the experience of hearing and vision that matter, but it's also your memories that are linked to specific things that you're hearing and seeing, and also your cognitive interpretation of things that you're hearing and seeing. So that's a lot of brain real estate that no longer gets that activation once you lose some of these senses. This is why it's a big deal when people start to lose these senses early in life. Then you start to have increased periods of time where those neurons aren't getting activated. Whereas if you lose some of those senses later on in life, it may not be that big of a deal because you're not living that much longer for that neurodegenerative process to start to happen. But when people lose some of these senses midlife and they don't have therapies to kind of address some of these sensory losses, then their risk for dementia starts to go up and you have a decreased resiliency of your brain to the processes that might lead to future dementia.